very happy to have Mariampolski back with us. Hi and I have known one another for many, many years as members of the Qualitative Research Consultants Association. We were both presidents at different points, but he's here today in a totally different capacity, which is after having his own company for many years in market research. He's written books on ethnography, which is observational research. He went in a totally different direction of collecting and being a dealer of postcards of vintage New York. They're wonderful views of our city. And I think he's got some great ones to show us today about Coney Island. So I'm going to turn it over to Hi. If Karen put the note in chat, it is coming from her, not from me this time. And if you have questions, comments, they're welcome. Hi will either address them as we go or towards the end. So Hi, again, we thank you very much for being here, and we take a little vintage trip to Coney Island with you. All yours.
Thank you, Judy. I want to say it's always great to be here with you and to continue our friendship and collegiality a little bit of a different way, but it's still very fulfilling at this end. My talk is about Coney Island, and it's titled "Wish You Were Here," part of a continuing series on the history of New York through postcards. And if we're talking about the history of New York through postcards, I think Coney Island represents a very important moment, both in the history of the city as well as the history of postcards. As we'll see, they were both intertwined deeply. Coney Island has always been more than just a place, and I like to describe Coney Island as a metaphor. A metaphor is an idea that stands for other ideas, and Coney Island has been not just one of New York's most important metaphors. It's also a metaphor that describes the history of the 20th century in New York City. Coney Island stood for many things, and it coincided with what in postcarding we call the postcard craze. In other words, during the first decade of the 20th century, there was a boom in postcard production and collection and trading and mailing. And that boom happened because lots of other booms happened. There was also a boom in printing processes, a boom in mailing services, and in New York, there was a massive boom of population. Postcards are important because for the longest time, they were our email. They were the quickest way to get a message elsewhere, and they allowed people to send a visual greeting. It wasn't, people sent visual greetings because in many cases, they weren't terribly literate. You read many of the old postcards, they don't sound terribly literate. So sending a picture of something you liked, something you were interested in, or a place you had been, was a quick way to send a message, and the messages were often very short. Back in the first decade of the 20th century, we were able to send out a postcard in the morning, and I had postcards in my own collection that say, please come to Uncle Jack's funeral at 2 this afternoon. It depend on 3 mail deliveries a day, and letter carriers could read anybody's handwriting. Back in my undergraduate days, I learned that one of the most important academic papers ever delivered was actually delivered at a a World's Fair delivered at the Columbian Exposition in 1893 and delivered by Frederick Jackson Turner, the historian. It was a paper about the closing of the American frontier. In the 1890s, historians were concerned about the physical closing of the frontier. There was going to be no more room, and wondered what would be. Well, the implications was that the United States, and New York in particular, discovered a new frontier. And that new frontier was the frontier of night, turning the nighttime into daytime. It helped that Thomas Edison invented the incandescent light bulb. Suddenly the streets could be lit, entertainment environments could be lit, and it turned day into, I'm sorry, it turned the nighttime time normally reserved for sleeping into daytime, and people could think of new activities. But let's go on to one of the first slides. And it shows you, I have a few slides that show how Coney Island developed. This is an image from a postcard by Detroit Publishing, 1900. And Coney Island started out as a very genteel area for the elite of Manhattan. It very slowly emerged as a partying space. And here are some of the earliest postcards of New York. This one, Detroit Publishing, 1900. The next one shows a series. It's a postcard by Raphael Tuck. It's Raphael Tuck was the largest postcard publisher in the world at that time, and Coney Island was one of the New York scenes that the Tucks depicted in a series of postcards on New York. Look at those very fashionable bathing suits there, and the young ladies walking into the water. And so, Karen, I'm sure you have one just like that, right?
I do.
I want floor length bathing suits, then I might wear one. But I have a question for you. We see their legs, they're covered, but we see their legs. Was that considered pretty daring at the time?
Well, let's say that we talked about the nighttime as the frontier. I think the ankle was the other frontier.
Okay.
So this is a card from the Raphael Tuck, 1903. And the next one is another one by an early New York City postcard publisher, H.A. Rost, also a card from 1900. And it shows the extensive resort hotels that were formerly along Coney Island. Coney Island stopped being an island around about the 1890s. It became a peninsula. The land that had cut off Coney Island was filled in. Coney Island became a peninsula. Eventually, it came to represent only the western part of Coney Island, and the eastern part of Coney Island, as many of you know, were taken up by Brighton Beach, Manhattan Beach, and Sheepshead Bay. These are the main nowadays to designate all of Coney Island, but these large resort hotels for the elite was the way Coney Island started out. Go on to the next one. Another interesting real photo postcard. This was an actual photograph that was made that shows the beach at Coney Island and one of the large resorts that existed at that time. Now, Coney Island at about the time this photograph was taken, about 1904, 1905, began to change from genteel, elite summer resort to an area of mass entertainment. So let's take a look at how Coney Island developed into an area of mass entertainment. And the next few postcards will give you a sense of it. Here's a postcard from, again, the Raphael Tuck Postcard Company. It's about 1906, 1907. But it shows how it's a card with a signature by Charles Fowler. But when they decided to develop Coney Island, it was developed into 3 large parks, massive parks, interspersed with private enterprises of any type. So the 3 large parks were Steeplechase Park, developed by George C. Tillieu in 1897, and then Luna Park, which came along in 1903, and Dreamland, which opened in 1904. You can see Luna Park and Dreamland apply this metaphor of nighttime to the goings on, and this is it's a beautiful card, but it's one of those early postcards that try to depict nighttime as the new frontier of the day. This one is Luna Park. The next
Hi, was the use of color fairly new? back then?
it was one of the I don't want to get too far into the weeds here, but one of the great technological developments of the era was the development of lithography, largely a German invention, and lithography was that process was able to depict nighttime extremely well. Lithography began to be used in about the 1890s as a major form of advertising printing, and during the early decades of postcard production was an important resource for postcard production. The major lithography was a German invention. The major lithographers were of German origin, and they literally traveled the world, bringing the printing process everywhere. Particularly important in Italy, in the UK, and in the US. And what happened in the US in many cases was that the images were made, photographic images were made here and then shipped back to Germany for processing, because that's where the lithographers were. It's also what also happened was that at the end of that decade, as Germany and other countries, European countries and the United States developed enmity, the lithography suddenly went out of fashion. So it's, but we'll see. Some of the next cards are also use the lithography. This is another beautiful scene that depicts Luna Park. Another also designed by Charles Fowler.
Everybody's very dressed up.
Everybody is dressed up, and people used to dress to go out. It's funny to see. The other thing that I'm amused by is that people went as families. There was no reluctance to take children along. And in a few slides up, we'll see how people got there. The next card is by the Kohler Company, and this is a card of Dreamland. Shows you Dreamland during the day. One thing that also became popular was the production of what we nowadays call novelty cards. Novelty cards have some special feature aside from the printing process. And the Kohlers were very popular because they invented and applied this process called hold to light. In other words, they used two layers of paper, and if you held it up to the light, you could have this daytime image. You held it up to the light, it turned into a nighttime illuminated image. So this particular set is still very popular, and there's one card known as Fighting the Flames that comes up in this Kohler set that is still considered one of the most valuable New York City collectible postcards. The last time I checked, they were priced at about $1,500 to $2,000 each.
Wow.
I think the next card is another card from Kohler. Okay.
Right.
So
Riding the elephant.
riding the elephant, that was one of the more popular Kohler rides, and you can't see the complete effect of the hold to light feature, but if you can imagine the moon and everything else gets lit up, illuminated when the card is looked at against the dark backlight.
So
Yeah.
somehow they got these women who are all dressed up to get up on this big elephant. That's amazing.
Imagine that. Well, everybody dressed to go out and dressed up
Yeah.
for the Coney Island. And so this is a card from about 1907, 1908. And the next card shows another type of novelty. The novelty here is the embossed card. The shells surrounding the image in the center are not just printed on there, but they're embossed. So when you feel this card, when you touch it, you feel the effect of the embossed shells. It's really very startling. The next card. This is kind of an interesting card because it shows another aspect of what Coney Island meant as a metaphor. And it stood for democracy. It stood for mixing of all types of people, all social classes, men and women, and what some things that George C. Tillieu himself wrote about was that he liked the idea of men and women stumbling into each other on these rides and touching each other spontaneously. It added, needless to say, to the delight of the experience, but also what was delightful for them at that time was the mixing of all these people. It was a period of mass immigration, and here nighttime was turned into a time for amusement, mass amusement, and people could be on these rides together and stumble into each other. The next card. Here's another kind of ride that shows the technological sophistication that was associated with Coney Island at the time. This was the Globe Tower. Not just a ride, but a kind of conceptual environment.
So how did this work? Do you know? I mean, people would go in at the bottom, you see these tiny figures. They couldn't go higher than that, I assume. Is that true?
Yeah,
Or they could look up?
as we'll see, one of the more popular forms of entertainment at this time was what was called a spectacle. And this was sort of a created environment. In some cases, the audience was integrated into the spectacle. In other cases, it wasn't. The Globe Tower was one of these spectacles that everyone could become a part of. But let's go on. We'll see the most popular spectacle of all was Buffalo Bill's Wild West. That was the most popular spectacle at Coney Island, and Buffalo Bill was able to take his show on the road. He showed the Buffalo Bill's Wild West all over the United States and all over the world, even to a command performance in England. But there were some other very interesting. You remember who the most popular science fiction writer was at the turn of the century?
God, I know it. I can't remember the name.
Jules
Karen,
Verne.
do you remember?
Jules Verne.
All right.
And, one of the most, here, if you advance, one of the most popular spectacles at Coney Island was Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which should be in our next slide. There it is. And here people were taken from one place in Coney Island to another place in Coney Island by an enclosed ship. They could imagine they were on a submarine, and when they were taken to the other place, they could have all kinds of exotic experiences. The spectacle was probably the most important form of entertainment in the 1910s. There's another spectacle that is depicted on this is a 1904 postcard. Journey to the North Pole by submarine boat. The next card shows The Boer War. The Boer War was that period's Afghanistan or something or other. The spectacle was of the British fighting the Boers. The Boers were the ancient Dutch and Belgian farmers in South Africa that were fighting for independence and were suppressed by the British. But the Boer War was an important piece of contemporary history at that time, and how it,
So, Hi, they would enact these little battles, oh, no, not so
Yeah,
little, they
yeah.
would enact the battles,
They would
right
enact
there in
it.
Coney Island?
Yeah, they would enact the battles of the Boer War, and people could be in the audience, or in some cases could participate at the sidelines.
Wow,
And that was part of the stupendous Boer War spectacle now at Brighton Beach Park.
and they leave Brooklyn Bridge, it says, so, yeah, okay.
Okay,
Should we go to the next?
let's move on. Now, I said before that Coney Island stood for new technology, and the breakaway new technology in the first decade of the 20th century was none other than the automobile. And there were many people who brought automobiles and that newfangled invention brought automobiles over to Coney Island so that people could sit in it and have their photos taken at a studio, pretending that they were actually driving the automobile. But many people remember that as the first time that they ever sat in an automobile, and and kept those pictures as family treasures. This picture is a family treasure. It depicts Sharon's grandmother, Bessie, who's the person at the in the left position, and her two sisters. And this was the first time she ever sat in a car, and never forgot that. And this was kept as a family heirloom for at least 120 years now.
By the way, my grandmother was also called Bessie, short for Rebecca, and married to my grandfather, who drove a cab in New York. So yeah, we have more in common than I realized. Hi, okay.
Yeah, so now the other we talked about Coney Island standing for democracy. The other new invention that Coney Island stood for was the idea of romantic love, and many cards were published at that time that have depictions of romantic love. I mean, up until this point, you married the guy that your parents told you to marry, and but the freedom of being a new immigrant to the United States and having Coney Island around released a flood of new opportunities, and one of those was romantic love, being able to choose your own partner, and not just postcard images, but popular songs of the era, and everything suddenly focused on romantic love, and kind of you knew you were no longer in the old country when you were able to choose. You had the freedom to choose your romantic partner. Okay. Let's move along. Well, let's say that time was not terribly kind to the massive parks. In 1907, Steeplechase Park burned down to the ground, and you can see it was utterly destroyed. This was the only one of the massive parks to be rebuilt. Eventually,
Sorry, go ahead.
eventually both Dreamland and Luna Park also were utterly destroyed, burned to the ground, and but were not rebuilt. And so eventually had to depend, as we move along, let's take a look at how people got to Coney Island, because it was a mass environment that would have been impossible without mass transit. And Coney Island became the most frequented stop on New York's mass transit system. So you could come from anywhere in the city for a nickel, be down in Coney Island and spend a good chunk of the evening there, and go home for a nickel. But this is what mass transportation looked like back in those days. Again, Judy, everybody dressed, everybody wearing ties and hats, and looking very, very snazzy and sharp.
So when you say mass transit, there are really masses there. I mean, that's looks like very crowded.
Very crowded, and there were also ships. You could also get to Coney Island by ferry. That's shown in the next pic, in the next postcard. You could go by excursion boat, leave South Ferry, get to Coney Island, spend a few hours there, and go back in the evening. But also the boats were very crowded and were considered not as dependable, because you had seasonal factors working against the boats very severely. The crowds going on an excursion boat for Coney Island. Now, let's say that by the end of the first decade, even though the outfits seem to remain the same, everybody's still wearing straw hats, straw boaters, and ties, but the rides began to take over. Everyone began looking for noisier and clankier and faster and speedier rides. I find this cute. It's supposed to be Noah's Ark, and you would expect Noah's Ark to be sitting in serene waters, looking for land, but no, this was Noah's Ark in the middle of some kind of ride.
All the people are white.
That was an issue. The starting especially in the 1930s, racial divisiveness became a major problem attached to Coney Island. And increasingly through the 1950s, Coney Island became both a settlement for non-white New Yorkers and became an area associated with crime. So this was one of the things that undermined Coney Island in the long run. There was a special kind of merry-go-round that a special kind of animal, the Coney Island, you're into merry-go-rounds. There was a special Coney Island style of critters that were used in Coney Island. By the way, does anyone else have any comments or questions on anything that they've seen so far?
Just
I
say
don't
it's,
see anything in the comments.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
But it does look very different than, well, when I grew up, we would hear about Coney Island, and this doesn't fit the image we had when we were kids, so it's fascinating to see that.
Yeah. Yeah, Coney Island,
Oh, wait, Martha has a comment. Go ahead, Martha, please unmute.
It's a question that goes way back to when, how you were originally talking about how popular postcards were. They've always been less to send than letters. How much did it cost to send a postcard?
well, the original concept was postcard cost a penny to buy and a penny to send. And
I like it.
the penny postcard. And you can imagine that when the price went to 2 cents, everybody was enraged.
Okay, good question.
But
Right.
during most of the postcard era, into the 1950s and 60s, price was still 4 cents. I'm sure many of you remember those old 4-cent Abraham Lincolns that everybody used on postcards. Let's go to the next slide. Now, this was one of Coney Island's most popular rides, the miniature railway that took people around the park, and they tried to create different environments within the park that people could experience. But this is what the miniature railway looked like. And one of the first environments that they hit that was one of the most popular destinations in Coney Island was featured in the next slide. Midget City. Midget City was what today we very uncharitably call a human zoo. It was a human zoo. People sort of locked up and living there, and people, visitors taking the railroad through the Midget City were moved by the little people riding little horses and little carts. But this became one of the entertainment features of Coney Island. And the human zoos at Coney Island included not only small people, but as we'll see in the next postcard, also included your ethnic types. One of the other, there were several human zoos connected with Coney Island. One of them were the East Indian natives. The human zoo was popular into the 1920s, and the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis was especially, the human zoos there were especially popular. At St. Louis, they included many individuals from the Philippines. Philippines had recently become an American territory, and people were very curious about some of the pre-literate populations of the Philippines. So,
Perform, they would have little skits or.
yeah, they would perform rituals, they would perform dances. You know, in many cases, people would perform the wedding dances associated with their culture. They would perform prayers. This was a very popular form of entertainment at Coney Island up until the 1920s. The tide turned in the 1920s, and people became more sympathetic. But earlier in 1904 in St. Louis, there were many individuals who died because they were accustomed to living in subtropical environments. Suddenly they were subjected to the American winter without being given clothes associated with the American winter. And many people literally froze to death. There's another feature that became popular at Coney Island, and what we call the freak shows. The Coney Island became associated with not just human zoos, but freak shows of all varieties. And many of the private amusements were in fact freak shows. This one is relatively benign, but as we'll see in the next postcard, it also included people who suffered from severe deformities, of illnesses of one sort or another. And these postcards were, you know, part of the profit-making venture. You came in, you paid a nickel to be at the freak show, then you paid a few extra cents to buy a postcard of the show to send back to mom and dad in Columbus.
And imagine getting this card out of the blue. God.
I know.
Okay.
But what happened was that they went for rides that were faster, noisier, clankier, and this turned out to be the desire that replaced that utopian impulse. It was the the utopian impulse slowly eroded
Mhm.
as a way of mobilizing technology. The technologies that underlie even today's amusement park rides were developed at Coney Island. They didn't, some of those technologies have not changed in the least.
Huh.
Hopefully they break a little easier.
Well, so that must have been pretty exciting when this came out, right?
Yeah, it was.
Mhm.
You know, loop the loop. You're going upside down for a big chunk of that. But it, let's say that by the 1920s, the utopian era at Coney Island began to change, and it began to turn into, well, also the mass spectacles became less popular. The major parks needed to expand, and they needed to expand in particular so they could stay open at night times during the winter. New York night times are not in the winter, not especially accommodating. So
Right.
you had to develop indoor theatrical environments and spectacles that would keep attracting people. One of the things about Coney Island was that it just needed to be continuously changing because the things that drew people in the previous year didn't work the following year.
Yeah.
It's the giant racer. Here's a nice example of a private a private ride. So you had the major parks, and then you had the private rides and the private spectacles and amusements and the food services. So the giant racer claimed to be the largest roller coaster of its time. Whether it was, I'm not sure. But some of these roller coasters would make today's roller coasters would be very competitive against today's roller coasters. Here's the Mammoth Pit, one of those indoor nighttime spectacles that had to develop at Coney Island to keep the people coming during the colder months. And the animal acts. These became extremely popular. The lions and tigers and bears. Frank Bostock, the Animal King, became one of the more popular amusements at Coney Island. Again, simply because it allowed people to come there at night. Now, one of the sad things that happened was that when Luna Park burned, many of Frank Bostock's animals were killed. And one of the amusements that were set up close to Mr. Bostock was how do you describe this? A spectacle of environments for premature babies.
Oh,
So they had this spectacle with premature babies, including several infants of the owners of that spectacle. And when the park burned, some of the babies involved got hurt because of
you're talking about baby animals, right?
no, talking about baby humans. Yeah, they were in incubators, early incubators environments that tried to promote baby survival, and that became a hot commodity one year at Coney Island. Again, every year looking for new ideas that would enthrall people and become a spectacle that people would find inviting. But many of the ideals turned into those kinds of spectacles and freak shows.
Oh, parachute show.
The about 60 animals were killed.
Yeah.
60 animals were killed when Dreamland burned to the ground. And you would think that Luna Park would do better when Dreamland was burned. No, it didn't happen. Coney Island began to kind of develop a reputation as going downhill when Dreamland burned. People did not get over the loss of the animals. That was a much loved component of Coney Island. The other thing that happened was that prohibition hit in the 1920s, and it was no longer easy to get alcoholic beverages, and that had an impact. And in the 30s, of course, it was the Depression that had an impact on the day-to-day success of Coney Island. As a result, ownership changed very continuously. It was difficult to keep managers as issues were going on. Some of you may recall that one of the great events in New York City at the time that Coney Island was present was the New York World's Fair of 1939, 1940. Needless to say, the New York World's Fair brought a lot of people to New York, not necessarily to Coney Island. I'm sure you all know that the World's Fair location, Flushing Meadows Park, and Coney Island are just about at opposite ends of the subway system. So many people avoided Coney Island. But at the end of the World's Fair, some of the more successful rides from the World's Fair were shipped off to Coney Island. The best known of these was the Great Parachute Jump. Started out at the New York World's Fair and ended up in Coney Island.
Hi, there's a question in chat that I got. Do you know how the fires, going back to the fire, do we know how it started?
Um,
I mean, was it arson or?
it
accident.
wasn't arson, but, you know, let's say, you know, these were, um, fire codes were not, at their most, highly developed. These were environments. Most of them were just made of wood.
Mhm.
I saw, excuse me, I saw a play about 10 years ago called Fire in Dreamland at
Yeah.
the Public Theater. I don't know if you're familiar with it. And it depicted some of the events that occurred during that fire. And there was a focus, I thought, which really bothered me, on the animals that died. A lion that was trying to run away and was shot, and it was a harrowing play. It really was. And it probably, I imagine it was very heavily researched so that it was accurately portraying what had happened.
It was a harrowing experience. I'm not familiar with the play, but if they described it as harrowing, it certainly is accurate. And as you noted, many of the animals were shot by their keepers because they escaped out of the burning environments and were suddenly liberated on the street. Altogether, 60 animals were killed. And this was Coney Island's favorite amusement at that period. So you can imagine that it had the effect of, well, just depressing everyone. Many of the freak shows during the 1930s, freaks themselves became less popular during the 1930s. There was finally some compassion shown about the freaks, but many of the freak shows turned into what became known as hoochie coochie shows. And hoochie coochie is a term for female burlesque entertainment.
The musical On the Town with Gene Kelly.
Uh-huh.
Vera Ellen is Miss Subways, and she's taking ballet lessons, and he finds out later she's a hoochie coochie dancer in Coney Island. It's a big scene, and she's very embarrassed, but he loves her anyway.
I'm glad about that. Yeah, but the hoochie coochie shows became popular at Coney Island, and you know that I won't moralize about it. I won't say it was bad per se, but it certainly compromised the child-friendly image of Coney Island, and in some
Yeah.
Coney Island began to be associated with prostitution and crime.
Mm.
But you know, but they got some great rides. In the in the 1940s, of course, there were the wartime doldrums, and people did not come back to Coney Island terribly enthusiastically because it was not appropriate to be there having a good time while American soldiers were dying overseas.
Should I go to the next one?
I was going to say before leaving here that Luna Park burned in 1944. And when Luna Park burned, there was almost no advocacy for rebuilding Luna Park. Everybody more or less decided to do something else with Coney Island. And Coney Island became, as I pointed out earlier, a place where housing developments mass housing developments, housing projects came in, and the idea of a genteel environment receded. One thing that Coney Island had going for it through all of its ups and downs was the magnificent bathing beach. And the bathing beach indeed was magnificent. It through every period, it kind of saved Coney Island when the amusements receded as the draw. The bathing beach still attracted people. Here you can see that the ankle is a little more ankle showing than in those other pictures.
But no knees.
the I've got 3 pictures here, each of which depict looks like the boys finally got out of their uniforms, and here the girls are showing a little bit more leg.
I'd say, yeah. But they were separate, they kept separate anyway, yeah, okay.
Yep.
Mhm.
Yeah, so the bathing beach always was something that helped pull Coney Island through. And then there were some of the legacy rides, and many of you, when you think of Coney Island's most important legacy ride, there's the Cyclone, which is still considered the best roller coaster in the world. And there are people, lots of people who come to Coney Island just to go there for the Cyclone. It's
Have you ridden it yourself? It sounds pretty scary to me.
it sounds pretty scary to me too. I've never ridden it myself, but my daughter-in-law, who thinks of herself as an aficionado of roller coasters, has ridden it, and took my grandson there recently. I wanted me to along, but I demurred.
Does Rita have did you want to comment, Rita?
Yeah, I went to Coney Island in the 40s with my future husband. We were then both teenagers, and rode the Cyclone, or the roller coaster we called it. I'm not sure it was that and the parachute jump were the 2 scariest things I've ever done in my life. I never did them again. And I have to tell you that the picture you showed before that was very daring, because they were the first one-piece latex bathing suits, which were considered very revealing. And my mother was very upset when I got one, because bathing suits before that, you had a little skirt. But we went just once to Coney Island, but it was, there was a fun barrel that I remember where you rolled through the barrel.
I'll get to the barrel of fun in just a minute.
Good. But I want to tell you that parachute jump really scared the wits out of me. We did it once, and the roller coaster, I had my head down the whole time. Never went back, but eventually he went into uniform not too long after that, and then we got married. But it's a fond memory, because it's one of the first dates with my future husband.
That's very nice.
I'm really
And hi, in case you don't
We
know.
took the subway out, the same subway, for a nickel.
Yeah.
right.
So Rita turns 99 next month. So
wonderful.
she has a
You
lot
could
of
have guessed
history.
that.
Great. Thank you, Rita.
Thank you.
Go ahead,
Thank
Hi.
you for bringing these back.
So during the 1950s, as we say, things changed again, and Steeplechase Park became the last of the major parks to close down. And I don't know if any of you remember this, but Steeplechase Park had these horse uh, well, these wooden horses that you raced through the park. And I remember going there with my dad when I was a kid, and racing the horses was a very, very exciting and popular thing to do. And then at the end of the horse race, you entered into this barrel of laughs, which was I don't know. I recall it as sheer terror because you came into the you came off the ride and you went into this barrel that was rotating, and of course everybody tumbled and fell onto each other as the barrel was rotating. You finally made it out to the front of the tunnel, and you realized you were on the stage of a theater, and dominating this theater was if I remember correctly, his name was Slatko the Clown, who was also a dwarf, and he had two weapons that he used on everybody going onto his stage, and the theater was filled with spectators. His two weapons were a cattle prod, really electrified cattle prod, and a little blowgun that he used to blow the skirts of the young women. And so before you got off the stage, you went through his world, and you were a spectacle there for everybody else. But Steeplechase Park was in the end not successful. They tried to restage. They tried to turn it into more of a family resort experience. But I think by the 1950s, time was up for Coney Island. People's tastes had changed. The idea of going to the subway to an amusement park was no longer that desirable. In fact, much of New York's population, middle-class population, had moved off to the suburbs, and were now interested in nicer beaches in Long Island and New Jersey. And so the attraction of Coney Island really became minimal. It wasn't just suburbanization, it was changing tastes. The 1960s were the days of Europe on $5 a day. So people's aspirations for travel became broader. You could go to Europe and not depend on an artificial environment in New York City. So little by little, Coney Island, the major parks closed. In some cases, there were some smaller private parks that were created. It still got some of the traffic, but Coney Island itself became associated with crime. There were some spectacular crimes that were committed in the 1950s. As I said earlier, they had experienced some population change. So Coney Island became what was regarded as a slum, and many people avoided it on purpose and began to look for ways. Oh yeah, this is the line waiting to enter the horse area at Steeplechase Park. Steeplechase Park developed a large swimming pool that became a draw. You could bring your family there. You could get a subscription for the summer and bring your family over to use the pool at Steeplechase Park. But when Steeplechase Park closed, I have a date here for that. I think it was 1967. It was something new had to be done with Coney Island, and there was one thing that was done was to go back to one of the core features, one of the core values of Coney Island, and that was the going back and relying upon Coney Island's favorite food, which was the hot dog. From the very beginning, the hot dog was associated with Coney Island, and one of the annual events that has become very important in Coney Island's revival is the Nathan's Hot Dog Eating Contest, annual event on July 4th. And for those of you who are interested, the 2022 winners on the men's side were Joey Chestnut. Joey Chestnut is a frequent flyer as far as these events are concerned. He won the $10,000 prize by eating no fewer than 63 hot dogs and buns.
Oh, God.
Good way to make $10,000. Joey Chestnut weighs 229 pounds, and he's from Westfield, Indiana. The female winner was Mickey Sudo from Tampa, Florida, who ate a mere 40 hot dogs and buns
Were they timed?
for her $10,000 prize. Nathan's Hot Dogs continues to use Coney Island as one of their advertising positionings. And when you think that Hebrew National uses its relationship to God as its positioning, Coney Island still has a big chunk of marketing power.
I just went to a concert on West 68th Street, 69th Street, and Nathan's has a little food stand right on Fifth Avenue. Yeah, so they've managed to continue.
The other thing that has become emblematic of Coney Island in June is the Mermaid Parade. This has been another very successful attempt to bring back Coney Island. Mermaid Parade is America's largest art parade, and in its most recent year, attracted 800,000 visitors. So we leave this presentation with the secret of where the Coney Island hot dog comes from.
Hi, Martha's question, I think, is how long does Joey Chestnut have? What is the time frame?
10 minutes. 10 minutes for 63 hot dogs and buns. And this is where hot dogs come from, if you don't.
Oh, God.
So thank you for sharing this time with me. Does anybody else have questions?
Well, hello.
Yeah.
Can you, actually, here in Florida, my senior community, hand worker, that's the family that started Coney, that started Nathan's.
Nathan's,
And
yeah.
one of the hand workers is here, and he's got his business cards. And actually, I read the story of Nathan's, and it's a very interesting story. I spent a lot of time in steeplechase when I was younger, and I loved amusement parks. I loved the horses, and I've been on the Cyclone a number of times.
That's great.
And the highlight of my young life was I finally became tall enough, because I was a little short then. I finally became tall enough to go on the parachute jump, and it was great.
Oops, yeah, it's got to fly or something. Yeah, anyway, that's good. So it didn't scare you too much, Malcolm, it sounds
No,
like.
I love that stuff.
Yeah.
Than I am.
Yeah,
Daredevil.
I'll say this, I've kind of tempered it a bit in recent years, but I do love it. One of the first places I went in England when I went to London was Battersea Park, which was the English. This is many years ago. I don't know if it's probably still there. So I love to go to amusement parks.
Well, for 75 years, Coney Island was the largest amusement park in the world. It finally gave up its title to the Disneys,
Ah, okay. Which is having its own problem.
which is
Well,
having-
hi, this has really been a treat. It's wonderful history of New York, and we know Hi has vintage postcards of New York from many different aspects, and we hope you'll be back with us for future ones. So thank you. We're glad everybody came today, including the Metro Club members.